Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to BDC Digital Academy Season 2. Uh, really good to have you here. Really sorry for having this really early in the morning. It's just with work and family, I have other priorities throughout the day, so we had to do it very early. What we'll talk about today is debate strategy. It's obviously it's not going to be an overhauling set of things that will cover all strategy in all debates because I don't think that's possible. We'll just discuss some key things that I've learned over the last few years of debating, and I guess we'll have four broad takeaways by the end of the lecture, and I I think that's a good place for you to start thinking about debate strategy. Yeah. So before we begin, I think it's important to understand what is strategy. And it's a word we commonly use in both debating as well as business. I'm a business student myself, where we talk about it in business school or in real life business, deciding the strategy of a particular business. Uh, I think it's very similar to debate strategy. So the way I think about strategy is in a world of limited resources, say you have little money when it comes to a business, you need to decide how you invest that money amongst many possible options in order to maximize return. And it's not too different for debate. You have limited resources and you need to decide how to use those resources to maximize your returns. So, what are these limited resources in debating? In debating, especially in world schools debating, where I presume a lot of you will be debating soon, you only have 8 minutes. Or even if you're talking about British parliamentary debating, you only have 7 minutes, which means because you don't have unlimited time, you have to best use that time to decide what the right option is, or which arguments, or which rebuttals, or which analysis and framing to use. Because if you spend time using one set of arguments, you lose out on that time that you could have otherwise spent on making another argument. And the way you need to think about maximizing returns in debating, as opposed to a business, is finding the most convincing path to victory. And sometimes, especially, and this is my reflection, it's often difficult to do all the things you want, especially if you're an ESL speaker where you don't have English as your first language. No matter how hard you try, no matter how much improvement you make in your efficiency, you will need to consciously not do things and consciously do things, right? So it's important to know what things are more effective and what things are sometimes less effective, sometimes an absolute waste of time. And of course, strategy assumes you have content that can be covered in more than 8 minutes, right? And the reality is, if you have content that doesn't even extend to 8 minutes, there's no room for strategy because you are struggling to come up with content to begin with, right? So obviously, this strategy comes in with the assumption that there are choices to be made, and you have to make those choices to maximize your chances of winning the debate. Okay, so I hope that's clear. The role of strategy is in picking and choosing what to do and what not to do. If you don't have that choice to begin with, there's no room for strategy in debating. Now, a common perception, and this is something that I've heard from a very young age, from even a lot of senior debaters, it's you can teach a debater anything, but you can't teach them strategy. Which is why I wanted to take on the challenge of possibly breaking this myth. And the reason why I do believe it's a myth is because obviously I have learned strategy over a period of time. It's not like I was born, I started debating in 2011. If you ask even me from 2015, on reflection, I would possibly think I knew absolutely nothing about debate strategy. And it is something I've learned, but the way I've learned it wasn't necessarily lectures or those kinds of things that you see on YouTube all the time, where there's theory that you have to follow. It's more trial and error, where I've done different debates, I've seen what's worked, I've seen what hasn't worked. And what I will do today is, in business school, when they teach you strategy, often the method they use is what we call the case method, where they take you through different real life business scenarios or real life business cases and make you make decisions in those cases. Um, Obviously, there's still a lot of you, so we can't do like interactive, and of course we have limited time. But what I'll try to still deploy is the case method when it comes to debate strategy. So I'll take you through different debates that I've done. I've only used uh, resources that are readily available online or speeches that I've given that are recorded. So you can go back and look at the whole debate if you want to. But in those debates, I'll try to explain some of the choices that I consciously made when it comes to strategy and why those things are useful. Okay, so I hope that's clear in terms of context when it comes to debate strategy and how we will go about this lecture in terms of deploying strategy when it comes to debating. Cool. So theme number one that we're going to discuss is simplifying debates. Now, I'm a big believer in not having complex debates. Couple of reasons. The first realization I had over a period of time is efficiency. I cannot respond to everything a really good opposition makes if that opposition has English as a first language. And the more people you debate with from different cultures, from different backgrounds, you'll see those who have more fluency will be able to cover a lot of material, right? And it's really difficult for you to respond to everything, frame everything, and then also come up with your own material. That's number one. Number two is I also realized that I don't trust a lot of judges to make the right calls without being politically correct about it. And the more complex you make debates, the more places you have the debate in, the more they're likely to get confused. So with time, I've realized I have a bias for simplifying debates as much as possible. And the way I do that is by creating as few clashes as possible, right? How do you do that? You do that by what we call outframing some parts of your opponent's case as opposed to responding to it. Say, instead of saying what you're saying in this part of your case is untrue, or here are the reasons why it's logically incorrect, just saying that part of your case is not important or doesn't make a lot of sense and doesn't have a lot of relevance to this debate. Okay. So let's get into that with an example. So this was an Oxford IV round, I believe. It was round 4 of Oxford IV. The motion was, this was in 2021. So the motion was, this House supports the current rise in energy prices. We were opening opposition. Our opening government was a really good team. It was an LSE team. The speaker, I was speaking as leader of opposition. The speaker before me was Matt Kaito, who's an excellent debater, was world's best speaker. And he is one of the most efficient speakers that I've ever seen. It covers huge amounts of ground when it comes to material width. And in this debate, among the 15, I don't even remember how many arguments he made, but it felt like it was 15. One of the things that he argued was the fact that there are certain outcomes that are not as bad, because while there are higher prices of energy now, because of demand and supply reasons, these prices will eventually fall in the mid to long term. And therefore, the harms are not as bad as opposition would believe. It was preemptive to defend some of the benefits that he was talking about, right? So let's just look at the way I responded to that material in the debate.
First, I'm extremely confused by why a long-term trend of reduction of oil prices can be on their side, because presumably, of course, demand and supply always evens out. So naturally, even if we're defending low energy prices, if it's low and there's an increase in demand in the long run, prices will increase as well. Surely this debate is not about the cycle of economics and what will eventually result from it, but a necessary analysis of trends that we see in the modern day and what is best used for the context that we see today, right? Because otherwise it's just a cyclical analysis of, long-term periods and the fluctuations that you will see for time immemorial where prices rise and fall again and again, right? So none of the analysis of OG that talks about reduction of specific energy prices in the long run makes sense because it's cyclical in nature.
So what did I just do? Instead of responding to that piece of material where I say, here are the reasons why it's not going to happen, or here are the reasons why it doesn't make a lot of, or isn't particularly relevant in the debate, I just said, look, judge this part of the debate doesn't make sense, because if you judge him on long-term benefits that come out of reduction in prices, surely I also can get judged by other long-term benefits that come out of cyclical economics for me. But what's most important is looking at the immediate term as opposed to deciding what happens in the long term over economic cycles, because ultimately it's all, ups and downs in any economy for any context. Yeah. So the thing to remember is, or the principle, this is just an example. The principle that you ought to remember is that it's easier to win debates strategically when there are less things to deal with. And instead of responding and spending a lot of time responding to something, if you can just make it less important or less relevant to the debate, it'll save you a lot of time and help you focus on the other things that matter. Now, then the question I get is, what are the ways you can do this? It's not an easy task. Are there any guidelines for how you can outframe something or make something less important in a debate? And so what I've tried to do is I've tried to plot the way I think about outframing or making something less important. The first I would say is think about which groups you should prioritize. So your other side may be prioritizing a specific set of groups. Your arguments may be prioritizing a specific set of groups. I think then the first question to answer is, which groups should we prioritize more, or who are more important in this case? And there are three broad ways to think about it. The first is, you can prioritize one group if you have special obligations to that group. There are many ways you can establish special obligation. So for example, in a debate, you can say your special obligations come out of reciprocity. So maybe you have more responsibility to people within your own nation than people outside of that nation, because you get a lot of things from people within your own nation. They provide security to you. They go and fight wars for you. There are people who contribute to the economy that give you the kind of social safety net that you have. They form a lot of the collective identities that give you meaning. Therefore, there is definitely a more primary duty to help people of your own nation than those outside. And this is used in many debates. There's a motion about, opening borders for everyone, free immigration. And a good way you can argue for not doing that is by saying there are special obligations that you have by reciprocity to your own citizens as opposed to others. You can also argue special obligations basis complicity. If you created a problem, it is probably your responsibility to solve that problem. So for example, in my world schools, when I debated in 2016, there was a motion about poverty and the fact that you have whether you have a moral obligation to donate all your wealth to poverty after meeting a basic income. And the way we argued for one of the principal layers is by saying, because individuals have created the problem of poverty by voting in politicians who haven't redressed in the past, by actively making poverty worse, by doing things like conspicuous consumption, it is our responsibility as human beings to redress for it. You can also argue, say, through reparation, that you have special obligations. So if your forefathers benefited arbitrarily by theft and plunder because of colonialism in the past, it is your moral obligation to redress for that by providing reparations. You can also say you have special obligations by, say, you have consented to a special duty. So if you're a parent, it is your moral duty to protect your child because you've consented and consensually created that child and consented to the responsibility of becoming a parent. So primarily, you can say, regardless of outcomes, it doesn't matter who's more benefited. If one group has a special obligation to the other group, we ought to prioritize that over anything else. The second way you can argue this is vulnerability. You can say that certain groups are more vulnerable, and it is our responsibility to protect them regardless of the degree of impact. So say one person is a millionaire, has $1 million, and you strip all their income. Say you strip $900,000 and bring him down to $100,000. Someone else has $5,000 and you only strip $3,000 and he reduces his income to $2,000. while you reduce $900,000 from the first person, which is a much bigger harm than reducing $3,000 when you think about the absolute reduction, it's still better to do the first than it is to do the second, because the person in the second case becomes far more vulnerable. Losing $3,000 from a position of $5,000 hurts you far more than losing $900,000 from a position of $1 million, right? And therefore, we ought to protect the second individual more because he's more vulnerable. And the way this manifests in a lot of debates is through what we call intersectionality. When you can say, we ought to prioritize, say, an African-American woman as opposed to just an African-American. Because this person not only suffers by virtue of the African-American identity, they suffer by virtue of the fact that they're a woman, and there are structural barriers to that independently as well, right? And therefore, they're more vulnerable. But one thing that you ought to keep in mind, and I find it quite silly at times, is in debates I've seen a lot of teams say, say there's a comparison between helping 100 poor people versus helping 5 really, really, really poor people about to, starve, right? It's not like you can really defend the 5 really poor people as more important than the 100 poor people, because even in that case, while they're slightly less vulnerable, right, they're still in a pretty bad situation. And it's really unpersuasive for you to say, yeah, we'll let go of the 100 poor people for the 5 really poor people, right? So just do keep that in mind. I think it's important to know where to draw the line when it comes to vulnerability and, possibly not take it too far. Yeah. The third thing you can say is there are groups we should prioritize when we have a unique ability to help them. So how does this manifest? You basically say that there are no alternatives. So say in criminal justice debates, you sometimes defend subpoenaing a witness, which is basically forcing a witness to testify in court, by saying that there are no alternatives and this is the only way we can create justice, because sometimes there just aren't any witnesses and crimes happen when there are no alternatives or there are no other people. This is the way you often defend climate change, where you say, unless climate change is such a big problem, unless every single individual contributes in stopping it, right, there will not be a sustainable solution to that problem. And therefore, every single person is in a unique position to help, and there are no alternatives. Everyone has to come in. You can also say that, for example, in debates about war or intervention, where you say the US ought to do this because there are no other actors that can take on this mantle and, intervene into this geography and protect these civilians in that case, right? So I think these are the 3 broad ways in which you can think about this. Is there other ways we can prioritize is a question I've got, right? So we'll go through 4. So the question is, I'm guessing, what are the ways we prioritize which material? I'll take you through 3 or 4 broad ways, and we'll do a lot of discussions about them. So this is one broad way. Let me go through the others, and then at the end, if you still have questions about it, you can ask. Yeah. Cool. Second, once you've decided which groups you ought to prioritize, I think it's important to understand which effects to prioritize. Now, the underlying assumption here is you know which group to prioritize, because I don't think these kinds of framing work when there is disagreement about which group to begin with, right? So once you've decided this is the group I ought to prioritize, then the question is, which effects matter when it comes to them, right? The first, I would say, the most simple way to do this is by thinking about numbers and saying, look, you protect, say, 1 or 2 individuals on your side, I protect 10. And therefore, while the group is same, within that group, I have a higher number of people protected. So what are some debates where this is used? Number 1, you can think about this in criminal justice debates. You can think about it, say, if you're defending deterrence, a very powerful way to do that is by saying, look, we should punish this criminal very aggressively, because it's not only just the few individuals who are victims now that receive the catharsis or the closure, but it's also about discouraging future criminals because we have an infinite number of future victims that we protect, right? Or you can do that by also defending retribution, where you say we need to put people behind bars and keep them there for as long as possible or for a strong amount of time. Because while while we're putting them there, it's not just about keeping the person they've already hurt safe, but future victims who they could have hurt if they're out, right? You can also use this in, of course, military strategy debates where you discuss what is the best and most effective way to end a war. And you say this method saves more lives for XYZ reasons, while the other side says, no, this method saves more lives for XYZ reasons. And this is done in debates about drones versus, on-ground military interventions. And it's a fairly simple way to close which effects to prioritize by saying one side defends a greater number of lives saved, or one side has more people that they protect. Now, the second way to think about this is it's not always about numbers. It's also about what matters more to people, right? And you can say, for example, if you're a Tibetan, right? Maybe economic emancipation into China or like full integration into China will help these guys economically. But does that really matter to the people in Tibet? For them, maybe practicing their culture and you're owning a separate identity is worth the economic trouble of doing this, right? And you can basically use this frame to recharacterize certain things that your opponents run by saying it's an insult to those people or what they stand for, and this shouldn't matter, right? So for example, in debates about, people isolating, you can say, no, in reality, even conservative parents also want to send their kids to school because they also care about the well-being of their child. It's really prejudiced of our opponents to assume that just because the parents are conservative, they don't care about the future well-being of their child, which requires education, which means even the most conservative individuals will also want to send their kids to school. You can also say this about, say, African Americans, where they say, of course, African Americans want to end police brutality, but it's not that they want soft on crime policies, because obviously they also want gang violence to end, because they are the biggest victims of it. They are the ones living in those neighborhoods that have to go through those realities on an everyday scale, right? So I think the way you think about it is by challenging what matters to people and, challenging the premise of what the case that your opponents are making. The third way to think about which effects to prioritize is possibly looking at the risk versus the reward, right? Maybe there is a potential for reward of a few things in some cases, but there's a huge risk in a lot of cases for which we shouldn't allow those things at all. Very simple example. Think about slave contracts. If someone really, really thinks about a slave contract, possibly in some cases, maybe this contract will be done consensually. Maybe they've weighed out the cost-benefit analysis and taken it onto them. But that's only in that one case. In a vast majority of cases, the people consenting to a slave contract will do it irrationally and will get exploited out of it, right? Which is why the risk is too high and the reward is too low. Therefore, you should not allow this effect. And therefore, it's not an effect we should prioritize, right? The third way to think about which effects to prioritize is concentrated harms versus diffused benefits. So sometimes there's like a specific set of harms and a specific set of benefits. But the harms are more concentrated on a specific group, but the benefits are very diffused. Two examples. Number one, think about gay marriage. In Western societies, the argument for not legalizing gay marriage is the degree of discomfort that religious individuals may feel when that is expressed in public. However, that is a very marginal potential harm that comes to them, and therefore outlawing gay marriage only gives a very diffuse benefits. There's some level of marginal satisfaction they know, because of the fact that, gay marriage is outlawed. However, if you outlaw gay marriage, the individuals who are part of the LGBTQ community genuinely go through very concentrated harms because they can't marry their loved ones, because they can't practice their core identity on an everyday scale. So even though the numbers are higher on the other side, which is possibly the number of religious individuals is higher than the number of individuals in the LGBTQ community, the benefits these individuals get are very diffused, which is why we ought not to protect the religious individuals, but the harms that the LGBTQ community go through are very concentrated, and therefore we ought to protect them. So these are, I think, some ways in which you can think about which effects to prioritize. One thing I would keep in mind is I've suggested a way to do this in the past, which I kind of regret in reflection, where I've said, you can say one harm is certain and the other harm is uncertain. One benefit is certain and the other benefit is uncertain. Therefore, always prioritize certainty. But in reality, in time, you'll realize it doesn't make a lot of sense. Because really, like when you tell a judge, my benefit is certain, therefore we should do it. That's just logically saying you're risk averse, which isn't necessarily always morally good, right? It's not like investing in safe assets as opposed to slightly riskier assets with high returns is a good thing, right? Even in the financial market. Or think about it. Maybe if you invest in a road today that will be built in 20 years' time, obviously the road being built is uncertain, right? Because it's so far away. But that's not a reason why we shouldn't do it, because while there is some degree of uncertainty, right, versus spending that money on something really immediate, maybe that road is good and there's fair amount of probability of it happening, right? So don't resort to this certainty versus uncertainty thing. It makes very little sense, is my reflection, and is possibly bad strategy in a lot of cases. So I think that's one realization I've had over a period of time. Cool. Third, and a very interesting way of outframing stuff is by saying, look, your argument, for it to be true, what I'm about to say needs to happen. Therefore, since my argument is logically prior to yours, your one doesn't matter, right? So for example, maybe there's a debate about foreign investment coming in or companies coming in and gentrifying certain areas, right? And the proposition argues that you will be displaced from your home if new companies move in because they'll take over land, rent will go up, you won't be able to afford it. But in reality, if you really think about economically underprivileged places, maybe in the absence of this company coming in, you're unlikely to have a job or unlikely to have a lot of financial well-being at all. Which means if you don't have that job, you're unlikely to be able to keep your house at all. And therefore, these companies coming in will help create jobs, will help improve the economy, which will help a lot of people who would otherwise lose their well-being and lose their homes, keep their homes, right? So therefore, this is logically prior to that conclusion, and therefore your argument doesn't matter in this debate, right? The second thing, or the second example I've given is whether you should prioritize economic well-being over democratic well-being, because in some cases you need to defend in debates eroding democratic values in order to protect economic well-being. And the way you can do that is by saying, look, if people do not have access to information, if they don't have education, if they don't have TV to get information, if they don't have access to the internet, it's probably unlikely that they'll be able to properly integrate and participate in a functional democracy to begin with. Therefore, your economic well-being often determines your access to information, which determines how well you can do in a democracy. Therefore, economic well-being is logically prior to accessibility to democracy. I think that's one way of arguing for that slightly unintuitive thing. So broadly, think about what comes before what and whether your arguments are logically prior. I think that helps set a lot of strategic priorities for your team. The last and most simple, possibly way of making something sound less important is by saying you're arguing for a principle which matters over the practical outcome on the other side, all right? And I think there are a few ways to do it. The first way is by saying, look, what is utile, which is what the other side is arguing, is not always moral, right? And you can do this in, there are a million different ways you can break the utilitarian metric in debates using thought experiments or using analogies. So Ashish Kumar has a fantastic lecture on this online. I encourage you all to read. But some simple examples are, number one, you wouldn't kill an innocent person to stop the riot happening in some other community, right? Or you wouldn't torture a person that is innocent in order to make sure that you get information that you otherwise wouldn't have got. Or a very simple analogy is the most effective way to keep society safe is by throwing 50% of the people in jail. Like anything that even remotely indicates you could commit a crime in the future, throw them in jail. But you don't do that because that's not necessarily moral, although it may be utile in terms of keeping society safe, right? There's some other really interesting thought experiments like the harmless rape, which Ashish has discussed on multiple cases. I'd encourage you to look through that. It's very, very powerful stuff. The second way to think about it is the opposite. It's what is moral is not always utile. And a very powerful example that I think I've also learned from Ashish, I think Sheng Wu used it in some debate, is to say it is. So, for example, during the Warsaw Ghetto uprising of World War II, the Jewish people that stood up possibly knew that they would go to their deaths when they're standing up for what is right. But they still did it because it was a moment of recapturing their identity and owning what it means to be themselves, right? Therefore, it's not only moral, it's praiseworthy what they did, right? We respect these individuals for the courage and the reclamation that they had. Obviously, it wasn't utile. They basically faced their deaths that would have been imminent anyway. But it gave them that a moment where they fought for their identities, and therefore, that's something that is worth protecting. The third way, and this is very complex, and I wouldn't encourage you to use it in a lot of debates, but it has been used in many cases. The LSE top breaking team, Abhinav and Arth, fantastic team, also used this in a semi-final of Worlds, but it requires a very detailed explanation for it to work. So what is the analysis? The analysis is basically practical outcomes or utility matters less than free will or choice or the fundamental principle that we often defend in a lot of debates. And the way you basically say that is by saying anything that has utility or value in the world has utility because I gave it value or I chose to give it value. So for example, the fact that I'm wearing a t-shirt now, its value exists because I choose to like this t-shirt and therefore give it value. If you give me a diamond necklace that's really expensive, it would possibly not have value because for me, I choose not to consider diamond necklaces as important to me, right? So the reason why diamond necklaces don't have value is because I choose to not give it value. The reason why this t-shirt has value is because I choose to give it value. So logically, value comes from choice. Since choice is logically prior to value or utility, choice, therefore, or free will, therefore, is the most important metric when it comes to morality, right? And I think that's the way you analyze it. It's basically borrowing the logic of, being logically prior, but applying it to a principle. So anyway, that was a lot of theoretical discussion, which I started the lecture saying that I would avoid. But I just wanted to take you guys through some ways to think about simplifying debates, outframing stuff, removing some things from the debate, because it helps your approach to the debate get easier by just saying, these are the things I will focus on, and therefore these are the ways I win those few things, as opposed to leaving the debate too broad and confusing judges and, drawing yourself thin because you will have endless amounts of material to respond to. Cool. Second thing that is really, really important to strategy, but is sometimes not prioritized, is characterization. What this means is defining how a debate applies. The reasons behind a debate often really determine whether or not you win a debate. So this is a motion that was set at WDC 2022. I believe it was round 7. And I'll just take you through the info slide. The motion was therapy speak. It refers to the significant expansion of psychological and medical language and concepts to daily life outside of the academic context. So when you start using mental health language, like this person is being toxic, or this person is gaslighting me, or this person has OCD, or you're referring to a temporary inability to focus as ADHD, right? When this kind of language becomes an integral part of everyday speak, right? And you start speculating whether other people have mental health problems, that's what the motion refers to as therapy speak, okay? And the motion was, this house opposes the popularization of therapy speak. Now, the debate that happened we were closing government, the debate that happened in opening half became a deadlock, and or somewhat of a deadlock. And the reason why is because opening government basically argued for a lot of harms that come from, calling people toxic, gaslighting, etc. But opening opposition argued for a lot of benefits that come from early diagnosis of mental health disorders, such as ADHD or OCD, that helps us, support a lot of people going into the future. But the question that was left unanswered was characterization. Which of these is more likely? Which is to say, is the diagnosis of toxic or gaslighting more likely to happen, leading to the harms? Or is the, a diagnosis of OCD or ADHD more likely, leading to the benefits? So fairly simple set of things we did on closing government. I'll take you through a small part of it. But I personally feel we won this debate purely basis characterization. So just taking you through.
The first thing I'd like to say is that not all mental health, when normalized and when made aware of, necessarily has positive associations with it. So for example, things like PTSD and OCD are naturally associated with something that's very neutral, right? You tidy up something a lot, or you have trauma of the past. But certain kinds of mental health language directly associate negative connotations with them. Things like you are toxic, you are a gaslighter, these kinds of things, regardless of how much the awareness is, the stigmatization only increases at a point in time where you're made aware of such diseases. First point of framing. Second point of framing, what kind of diseases are you more likely to diagnose from the perspective of society? You are more likely to diagnose the diseases or mental health issues that have negative connotations associated with them. There are 3 reasons why this is the case. Number 1, noticeability. When you interact with someone else and they're just tidying up, or they're just doing something by themselves that's neutral in nature, you're less likely to notice that because it has no interference with the way you conduct your life. But when they do something that directly harms you, i.e. they are toxic to you as you believe, you are more likely to notice it to begin with. Number 2, the threshold to think about it and discuss. For something to be important for you to think about and discuss amongst yourselves, it has to have some level of importance to you, i.e. you have to believe it has had an impact on you. Number 3, for this to be something that blows up on social media, it has to have sensational value, i.e. the news needs to be more spicy. This person, this boyfriend of mine or this friend of mine is a toxic human being, has more spice than, by the way, someone cleans up a lot, he has OCD. Why is this piece of framing important? Number 1, it undercuts all of OO benefits, because all of OO benefits are contingent on awareness of the positive diseases. If misdiagnosis happens, and it happens for negatively associated diseases, all the harms of OG are more likely to apply than the benefits of OO. This takes the debate over opening half for us, because we've proven what kind of diagnosis is more likely and which diseases end up getting awareness. Already winning the debate against opening on that front. Secondly,
yeah, so I hope that's clear. It's nothing but characterization. I didn't make any new impact. I didn't make any new argument. It just proved likelihoods of certain things happening more so than the other, right? And this characterization was enough to win the debate. We did do some additional arguments and additional impacts, but I do think this was the part of the debate where a lot of it started getting shifted. Secondly, and this is one of my favorite debates of all time, or my favorite debates that I've participated in. It was from a tournament called the IBA Nations League, where some of the best debaters of like all time participated. Possibly one of the most intimidating experiences of my life as well. So in opening government, we had a very strong team, Belgrade. It was Milos and Janko. In opening opposition, it was a Cambridge team, or in that tournament, they were Team England. In closing opposition, it was Team Singapore. So Ashish and Sharmay were in that team. We were closing government. So Mubarak Bhai and I were debating as Team Bangladesh. And it was a fairly good debate on opening half, where the motion was this house believes that comedians from minority communities should not base their comedy on stereotypes and slurs about their own groups. And in opening government, they had a fairly decent set of harms that come from if this person creates stereotypes about their own communities, they hurt those communities, and here are the XYZ reasons why they hurt them. In opening opposition, they said, no, this helps normalize a lot of problems and create social discourse around some of the problems that people every day go through. But if you really look through even the same, like if you look through the same logic as what was applied in the previous example, what was missing was the reasons why the nature of the portrayal would be harsh, or the reasons why the nature of the portrayal would be beneficial. And what we did was, and we were very clear about this in prep as well, Mubarak Bhai and I identified this very early, we need to give the reasons behind that happening for us to win the debate. Opening government gave one reason, which is comedy has a culture of offense, and therefore you ought to offend more to get more followers. Opening opposition gave one reason, which was because these people are from that community, they have empathy towards the other members of the community, which is why they will always do things in a way that is empowering as opposed to in a way that hurts them, right? So our strategy from closing government, again, had very few extra harms, but it wasn't primarily focused on harms. It was just using harms of OG, but characterizing why those are more likely to happen by proving there are more reasons why a comedian is likely to, err on the side of being extra hurtful or extra racist as opposed to extra representative or extra empowering, which is what opening opposition wanted to establish. Right? So I'll just take you through the part of my speech where I go through this process.
5 structural reasons, starting from like really simple stuff to more sophisticated stuff. Number one, I think these people are poor. They want money. Most consumers of comedy are from the majority. They're rich people who don't want to feel attacked. In that way, in order to please them, you often have to cater to their interests. Minority people are poor. They don't buy your comedy. Number two, let's say these people build up political capital. At a point in time where they build up political capital, you still have to cater to your core consumer base, i.e. even if you have some part of the story, it'll be small and subtle and spending like 5 or 6 minutes on, and it's unlikely that it'll become a nuanced story at a point in time where the trade-off involves attacking people in order to make it nuanced. This is because the life experience of a minority is often antithetical to that of the majority. Most of your terrible experiences are because the majority oppressed you. You have to attack them in order to sell that story in order to do that. Third, here's where we get more sophisticated. These people are misfits. I'm not being stereotypical. Indian parents don't like their children becoming comedians. In order for you to become a comedian, you often have to go against your family and often have to be the social reject within your family. If you're not one of these people, you're likely to be privileged. That's what OO concedes to. This is how we engage OO. If you're from Cambridge and an Indian, you know nothing about the Indian experience from a vulnerable background. And you cracking racist jokes about it means you're less likely to understand what it's like. Fourth, there's a competitive industry where there's a very unique set of USPs that each comedian has. The moment you step beyond it and you go into like undiscovered territory, you're likely to become political and blocked down. That's why Hassan Minhaj's show got cancelled, because he didn't want to trash on his own community, but wanted to talk about social issues. That's when funding that is in the hands of corporations takes money away from you. That's when the majority creates backlash against you. The competitive industry is one where also creativity is difficult. That's literally why John Oliver is the only one that makes his kind of comedy. No one else can come up with new versions of it because it's difficult. So you're likely to sell your USP, which is trashing on your own community. Fifth, there's an offensive culture in comedy. I'll give credit for OG for stating this, but the reason is because, and this is where we add to OG analysis, The people want to pay a premium to watch comedy. Comedy doesn't change your life. It just gives you satisfaction. In order for you to spend money, you have to see something different in it than what you get in everyday life. Everyday life has protected speech. States often don't allow you to be racist. States often don't allow you to express what your inner thoughts are. Comedy is a unique safe space where people pay money to see something that is not normal in everyday society. That's why the race for offensiveness exists, because people pay money for something they don't get in everyday life. That's how we add to OG. What does all of this analysis prove? Number one, OO loses because everything they have to prove depends on not having these mechanisms. It proves that the line between sarcasm and the stories through it shifts towards insults. And this also proves that even if there's one individual Dave Chappelle, the vast majority of the industry tilts towards it.
So clear, it's just characterizing what's important as opposed to running new conclusions or new arguments. Characterizations alone really determine a lot of strategy in debates. The one thing to remember is to not overdo characterization if it does not add value. And like teams often add unnecessary characterization that opponents end up outframing by just saying, you know, I agree with you. So in a debate about refugees, you don't need to spend 2 minutes explaining how the lives of refugees are really bad, right? Like, of course, obviously the opponents will just use the first strategy we discussed, right? Like point number one against your attempt at point number two by saying, yeah, we agree, refugee lives are bad. Here's why we make it better, right? So do add characterization, yes, but at the back of your mind, keep in mind, is it really helping me build my case? As opposed to becoming something opponents will agree with, as opposed to have a really hard time challenging. Yeah, there's a fine line between both, and that's what you need to remember. The third thing, and it's possibly one of my favorite pieces of strategy, it's use your opponent's own material as rebuttal, okay? Which is to say, sometimes you will see opponents will run two different arguments because the way your opponents think, and it's very interesting, I've seen this in a lot of teams. Most teams fail to think about the case as a whole. And they think about independent arguments that work in a case as opposed to thinking about how the arguments collectively work together. So I'll give you an example. This was an octo-final of ABP 2020, which was this house as a Muslim majority Southeast Asian nation would reject Saudi Arabian investments in education, okay? We were opening government. I was going as DPM. Our opening opposition ran two different pieces of material. The first piece of material they ran was, look, a lot of these Southeast Asian nations are vulnerable. They have very limited resources, and therefore it is important we give them resources so that they can get education, their lives can improve, their economic well-being can improve. Currently, they're in a really terrible situation where a lot of people don't have access to education to begin with. Fairly intuitive piece of analysis. In Prime Minister, we ran, Wasif was the Prime Minister. Wasif ran a bunch of harms about the nature of Saudi Arabian investment and how they coerce into certain bad practices, or they try to break up communities, etc. And another piece of material that opening opposition ran was by saying, look, obviously, when we take these deals with Saudi Arabia, we will negotiate with them. And obviously, we will not take on deals that are going to hurt us so severely. It's a negotiation process. No government wants to hurt their own citizens, something along those lines. Now, if you think about it in isolation, both of these pieces of material are not that radical. Like, they both make sense, sort of, and fairly intuitive as well when you think about them separately. But the problem is they don't work with each other. Now, what I want to take you through is one of my responses to it, which is to say, I didn't add anything new at all in the response I made. Like, not a single thing was added that was new material or new response. I just used these two pieces of material to respond to each other. Okay, so look at the response.
Then they say, oh, but we want the government to regulate Saudi Arabia. Funny logic, because the other part of their case is these governments are super desperate and really, really want the money. So if they're desperate, how exactly are they going to add negotiating power and add more clauses to where this financing is going to be used? Presumably, that would also reduce the ability to get the amount of financing that they get. So either you tell me these governments are powerful and not desperate, in which case all our arguments of increasing other forms of education apply, or they're super desperate and therefore they cannot regulate this education and MBS gets to do whatever he wants. Both of those scenarios are scenarios that we've considered. They're contradicting their case if they argue based on that.
So I added absolutely no response, but I basically broke both of those things by using them to pit themselves against each other, right? So I think this is a fairly powerful way you can get rid of a lot of material and debate and respond, and helps your strategy evolve. And I think the way you can also positively think about this is when you think about your own case as opposed to your opponents, don't think about just arguments. Your priority should always be the case overall and the path to victory. Is the path to victory clear? And am I being consistent in my logic in getting there? Are there two pieces of material that don't work together? And if that exists, it's possibly something that I should address more. So the key questions to remember: number one, do all arguments of opponent's case work with each other? And do the assumptions of one contradict the other? Number two, is it strategically useful to push one outcome over the other? So if it's more convenient to you to get one of those over the other, say that one is more likely because this one makes slightly less sense, and pit them against each other. Okay. The fourth thing I want to discuss is, and this is, I personally feel, the most convincing way to win a debate and possibly the most powerful strategy you can deploy. It's to win on an opponent's metric, where you basically say your opponent is hedging their case on X metric. We fulfill that metric better than our opponents. Okay, so I'll take you through a few examples. Okay, this was Oxford Ivy round 5. We were closing government. Our opening opposition was a really strong team. Tin was our opening opposition. He's a world's best speaker and world champion. And the motion was, this house believes that no platforming movements in universities have done more harm than good, right? And no platforming movements basically mean movements that aim to deny certain individuals from expressing their opportunity, from expressing their views publicly, right? And obviously, if you're CG in this debate, you can talk about, so first let's discuss what Tin argued for. Tin's case was primarily about protecting minorities and giving them safe spaces. Because of course, you know, it's a very fleshed out standard case that you'd expect from opposition in this case, which is if minorities are exposed to viewpoints that insult them, you know, when a really right-wing person comes and talks ill about immigrants, it's really difficult for them to go through that. It's another form of harassment. We need to create safe spaces in universities so that these people don't feel hurt, right? So the obvious the Gulf case, or the line of attack from Gulf here, that you usually see in these debates is about arguing why those viewpoints existing is still useful, because it generates good discourse that is important, it helps us challenge, etc. But the usual line of attack from proposition is not about flipping opposition's metric. Usually you don't see governments say, we protect minorities better by allowing these people to be platformed. But that was the burden we took on in CG, and we won this debate fairly convincingly, I personally felt. And a large part of my speech was in flipping the metric that Tin had set up by saying, we protect minorities better in closing government. And I just want to take you through how that was done.
4 broad areas in which I'd like to discuss. First, whether or not ensuring minority safe space is really hurt that much. In terms of mitigation, I think there are many safe spaces within universities that already exist for minorities that we can create even if they don't exist. These look like things like minority societies, such as Islamic societies all across the world, or celebrations of cultural days like Diwali in specific universities where you display culture, ask people of different communities to come and interact and understand what that minority culture is about. So on a primary level, I don't think there's no safe space that is present trend within these societies. Number two, opting out. I do think that OG says that you can opt out of these talk shows or whatever this is if you choose to. But the more fundamental question that OG misses out on is the premise that OO assumes that minorities want to opt out. I posit that a vast majority of minorities don't want to opt out and want to go to these rallies. Why is this the case? The first is, no matter how much you try to shoulder yourself or hide yourself from this rhetoric, the reality is you won't be in your university forever, even during your university years and post facto that as well. Your interaction with real society means these viewpoints will be present in some form or another. Maybe it will be on social media, maybe it'll be videos that you see, maybe it'll be people you interact with in real life. But in a vast majority of those cases, the feeling that you will feel is a sense of powerlessness where you feel you can't do anything about the fact that these views exist. There are things that you see on a screen that you can only shout into a pillow about, but can't often interact with. That puts you in a cycle where when you see that others are not defending you within that community, you feel more hurt in that cycle. Even if you opt out of this process, society is just designed in a way in which you can't ever fully opt out. You can't choose every single interaction in your life. You can't decide what the internet ultimately shows you in specific cases. These individuals often want to go, challenge, and speak out against these individuals, even if it means they don't lead to a fruitful outcome, because that's a way in which they can vent for themselves and achieve catharsis for fighting for their identity. So the fundamental premise of O itself is wrong. The third thing I'd like to posit is the trends through which you protect minorities will eventually evolve into a terrible trend. Notice Tin's POI answer. I asked him, who decides? They say majority people have to decide before deplatforming. But if you look at their analysis and their entire case, it's not dependent on majorities. The minorities hurt. They want to not only talk about minorities, but go intersectional. So it's not just one minority, it's a minority within a minority. So in principle, for you to protect the most vulnerable class, you need for those class to voice up and deplatform anything that hurts them. And that's the culture that we see today. The more vocal minorities, even though they're minorities, end up using their personal calculus to speak up and say that they're offended. Number two, the moment one individual is deplatformed by virtue of catering to one intersectional minority, you have a culture of deplatforming where more minorities speak up and more platforms are more deplatforming happens. What this leads to is a culture of deplatforming where the trend shifts away from the 51% disagreeing that this is good to even 10 or 15% of people disagreeing that this is good. But being more vocal about it, and for all the reasons Tin talks about, because of this culture of offense we create, we shun away these people from speaking. What this results in is a simple illustration of, say, a religious imam that wants to talk about why abortion should be banned, being deplatformed because it's an attack on the female identity of specific individuals. This ultimately hurts a different set of minorities, because those are minorities who might as well believe that abortion is something that we should not have. It's something that is akin to murder, but we genuinely remove from the discussion that happens. Why is that minority any morally inferior to the specific minority Tin wants to protect is a question that's left unanswered. We posit that you ought to err on the side of caution and just allow all views to exist as long as they don't violate legal norms, and then allow this discussion to happen. The fourth thing I'd like to talk about is why these discussions happen fruitfully in contrast to any other part of society. Before that, CEO.
So what's unclear to me is somewhat...
Last thing I'd talk about is why these discussions happen fruitfully. And the reason is because minorities, based on OO's premise, live in a state of insecurity. So maybe they feel hurt when these discussions happen poorly. There are three reasons why these discussions, when they happen in universities, happen more fruitfully. Number one, you have control of the platform. This looks like you deciding who the moderator is. So the conclusions and narratives around the discussion can be drawn by the university itself, not by an external party on Fox News. Number two, what time slots are allocated to specific individuals? Who gets what time is dependent on you. Number three, the questions that are rejected and accepted, maybe in a different platform where you don't have the control, example, some questions where you directly challenge the viewpoint get rejected because Fox News is in charge. Here, you're in charge. Number two, the nature of the challenge itself. When university students and academicians challenge, every fact that Jordan Peterson spews out can be instantaneously challenged with logic and counter facts. This is unlikely to be present in a rally where most of these people are uneducated. Number three, the ability for contrarians to speak up. You won't go to a Trump rally as a liberal because you're afraid of what that means. Here you get more of a safe space to put out your viewpoint. This is the only part of society where this direct challenge of that viewpoint can happen on such a profound scale. Nothing else allows this amount of discourse to happen. We need to ensure that their views are challenged by those who can challenge them. That's the only way minorities feel protected. Based on all criteria, we win.
So it's sorry for taking a long time. I just wanted to take you through how the whole speech was based on winning on opposition's metric. Yeah. And you can design your speeches and design the way you think about strategy or path to victory by trying to flip an opponent's metric. Okay. I'll give you one last example. This was an HWS round robin motion. This is the last video-based example we use. The motion was, this house prefers a world in which innate intelligence is distributed equally. So you will recreate the world where everybody will be born with the same amount of intelligence. And a fairly strong team on opening government from Hart House. What they basically argued for is what you would expect any government to argue, which is intelligence is an unfair advantage given to certain groups of people who are just born with intelligence but didn't deserve it, and therefore they get an edge in their lives over others. Redistributing it equally creates a more fair world for people to access or for people to be a part of. Therefore, it's much better to redistribute that intelligence. What I basically tried to do from opening opposition is by winning on that metric, which is if it is the most vulnerable people who don't get access in the status quo because they're not intelligent, there's another more vulnerable group of people who are now worse off because of the redistribution of that intelligence. Now, the reason why this is strategy is because the usual opposition case that you'd expect in such a motion is more about why having more intelligent people is necessary for the world, where, you have innovation, where you have a bunch of economic benefits, or, the way you evolve the world, evolve academic thinking, etc., and a bunch of benefits that come from that. But what we realized is it's not that we didn't run it, it's that we ran it later, and we chose to prioritize OG's own metric from OO and win on that metric, right? So I'll take you through how that was done.
Posit that nothing really changes. The privileges that certain groups will get will always happen, and this is for a couple of reasons. Number one, if you look back at history, the way that privileged groups have entrenched privilege is not due to the intelligence they had, but due to certain advantages, like number one, physical capacity. If you are stronger as a genetic pool, you have more ability to hunt and get access to resources and hoard them. Number two, often proximity to resources, i.e. if you are closer to trade ports by geographical lottery, you generally are more privileged. Number three, if you have first mover advantage, that benefits continents like Europe that colonialized and conquested literally all of the world. Funnily enough, intelligence was the least important thing historically because it required a lot of, times back then were reliant on limited knowledge, intuitions, and religions that deprioritized the role of intelligence because we just didn't have as much knowledge about the world. It's not that we lacked intelligent people in the past. The reason why we have reduced them is because of that now. Ultimately, that means there will still be people with privilege in both worlds. Assuming that is the case, why do we think this entrenches privilege? Before that, I'll take OG.
Why do you think individuals, even within society?
I'm saying that certain groups will have lots of advantages because of other factors. How does intelligence entrench privilege, or equalize intelligence entrench privilege? Intelligence is something that is currently randomized. If you look at research papers, most intelligence within all groups is normally distributed. This is because it's something that's out of your control. It's randomly allocated by God, if you believe in God, or by whatever hypothetical thing that creates humans is. What this means is it is a differentiating factor when economies and societies have to look for individuals. This is for a couple of reasons. Number one, you often cannot redress a lack of intelligence in the future, which is to say you can teach individuals everything else. If you hire a person, you can teach them through training, you can teach them how to be have a better personality that enables them to have cultural fits. You can teach them everything, but you can't give them a higher IQ because that's out of your control. Number two, this is also why the world has moved to increasingly utilitarian metrics where biases based on other factors have been reducing, which is why women have been included into the workplace, because you recognize that women can be intelligent. This is why it is less of a reason to step into the bias of privileging white people, because you realize that the cost-benefit analysis means you'll likely end up with a dumb white person that doesn't contribute to your profit mechanism. So that's how you've been able to balance out the cost of the incremental massive loss in profit for the incremental benefit of catering to your own biases. What this means is the status quo is one where intelligence, because it's distributed to all groups, is a reason why society has tilted towards minority groups, because they have intelligent people as well. The moment intelligence is no longer a differentiating factor, other criteria become the differentiating factor. This is why this weird thing of one doesn't compensate for the other doesn't make sense. You select people based on criteria. If you take a criteria away, you have to prioritize other criteria. What are these other criteria? Number one, CV, achievements. All of this is benefited by your privilege. If you have money, you go to a better school. If you have money, you get to access better ECAs, go to more worlds and have more debate achievements. Number two, it depends on your personality tests. What are these personality tests? How well you dress, how eloquently you speak, all of which is better taught for the privileged people who have a fancier accent in speaking English. Number three, it depends on your consistency, hard work in the long run, which is basically euphemism for how many of you have family troubles that stop you from working hard. How many of you have conceptual problems that make sure you have to opt out of the workout process or not pursue your education equally. Everyone with privilege gets far more advantage in all of these criteria. That means these people get more promoted. The conclusion of this and the impact of this is simple. When you look at schools, the segregation that currently happens based on intelligence includes smart black kids and smart white kids. When everyone is equally smart, it will be only based on white kids because the teacher is white and they preference those white kids. If you look at jobs, they'll selectively pick their own communities because they know everyone has the equal capacity. Even if they lack skills, they can train them, but they have the intelligence required. Why?
Right.
Pause it.
So, just final few reminders. Number one, just because you can win on their metrics doesn't mean you shouldn't win on your own metrics. Always do both if possible and run them with even ifs, which is we win on this metric, even if you don't believe that to be the case. On our opposition's metric, we also win. The second thing, of course, is you'll see that the times I've used this strategy have been against some of the best teams in the world, right? Tin and his team, Tin's a world champion, world's best speaker. When I was debating against Harthouse, Chris and Dhananjay, they're world's quarterfinalists, I believe. Very, very strong team. If your opponent's case itself is weak, sometimes maybe the metric that they've decided may not necessarily be a good metric at all. And therefore, if you start always thinking about it, it becomes poor strategy and you'll drag your own case down. So don't do that, obviously, but it's a very, very effective strategy, in my opinion, in the best kinds of debates, where if you can do this against really good cases, it really convinces a judge that you've won. Yeah. So what are the 4 things that we've learned today? The first is you have to simplify by outframing. Number 2 is you should characterize to win, and you should never underplay the role of characterizing in determining the outcomes of a debate, even if the conclusions are the same. Number 3, sometimes without adding anything at all, you can use your opponent's material to, challenge each other and use one part of their case to beat another part. And number 4, the most important metric in some of the most difficult debates to win, but if done, I personally believe is the most powerful way to win, which is winning on your opponent's metric, right? Say you achieve the kind of world they want to achieve better. Now, before I close, I want to take you guys through a case that I've recently made, very recently. So I was coaching Qatar for World Schools this year. And in round 1 of World Schools, the motion was, this house supports strict state secularism in Western liberal democracies. The definition of strict state secularism is basically prohibiting anything religious in public spaces. So no religious symbols, no crosses, no mosques or mosque symbols, no money being given by governments to religious schools and charities, nobody being able to wear anything that represents religion in public. So banning the hijab, banning the turban, everything, and not having an official state religion. Now, unfortunately, as like when you think of the motion, it's such an easy opposition, right? And it's a very skewed motion to opposition, in my opinion. Like if you go through what eventually happened at World Schools, about 70 to 80% of the wins went to opposition. So it was, in my opinion, a pretty bad motion to begin with and very skewed to opposition. Secondly, our round one opponents were Scotland. Scotland were the eventual World Schools champions. So having literally the toughest opponents in the tournament didn't help. So what I did at the time is, of course, just like all other debates, there was a case that was made that was going to be run in our first speech, which was our PM speech. But what I did was I predicted the line of attack that opposition, especially Team Scotland, would do. And I predicted the line of attack that LO would do, and then what DLO would say. And this is the only time I've gone into this level of detail, but I basically scripted the full DPM speech. Normally, the way I coach the kids is I script the first speech and leave the second and third speech to figure it out for themselves. Here, the entire second speech was scripted, which kind of sounds crazy if you think about it, because if you script the second speech, it reduces the ability of, the second speaker to adapt, respond to certain things that you did not predict would come out of LO. But I realized the cost-benefit analysis still makes sense, because sometimes strategy is about expecting what opposition will say. And I think this is the last message I want to end with, and I'll take you through our case. If you know what your opponents are going to say, you sometimes know what you need to do in characterization, what you need to do in outframing, what you need to do to win in their metrics. And my expectation was that our opposition team would have, number one, a fairly decent principle that says, you shouldn't restrict speech just because it offends someone else. Just because I'm wearing a hijab and it may be uncomfortable to someone else is not a reason why I should not have that right. My individual right is more important. The second is, if you do this, it'll really, really hurt minorities, right? Muslim women will not be comfortable to come out. They'll isolate. They'll go into, they'll not go to school. They'll not go to work. Those kinds of harms, right? Fairly standard two harms that you predict. So what was the PM speech? This is the less interesting bit, but I'll still take you through. The PM case was, number one, why it is morally necessary to free the public space from religion. We basically said, look, the swastika is a symbol of Hinduism that's really important. It's positive, right? It represents the sun. It's important to Hindu spirituality. We still ban it because to some individuals, such as Jewish individuals, it represents hate from the past. And even if it's not hate, religious symbols represent slander. So every person is told that unless they are part of this religion and following its commandments, they will literally burn in hell. So you see them as less of a human being, and your religious expression in public reminds them of that you want them to burn in hell because you believe that's the right way of life. So it is akin to hate speech and slander, and we ought to remove it. The second was a practical argument about, why we should not donate to religious charities, because the money they use is wasteful. They spend billions of dollars in beautifying churches as opposed to actual welfare. The money they use is exclusionary because they are, if you give money to Christian churches, they isolate Hindus. Those kinds of people don't get welfare. Number three, it's often used on backward welfare. So Christian schools often entrench things that are harmful for women or harmful for LGBTQ communities. And a third argument about why in the public, a lot of political rallies weaponize religious rhetorics and break the collective action problem. So you make it a religious duty for people to come out to vote as opposed to discussing logical policies. So this was a fairly standard PM speech. Now, then we predicted, or my prediction was, when you spend so much time on a principle and an opponent's case also has a principle, they will inevitably end up responding to argument one more and ignore argument two and three. So this was my pre-scripted DPM part 1. The first part of the speech I pre-scripted was I literally asked our second speaker to say, before getting into engagement, just a reminder of what they did not respond to, right? The first thing they did not respond to is the welfare argument, and how this is exclusionary, how it's a waste of money, etc. Number two, they also did not respond to how this distorts political proceedings. And it really, really, really is bad that they did not do this. And it's suicidal that these two arguments are left unchallenged. And this wins us the debate independently. And trust me, Elo from Scotland did not respond to these things. The responses for this came in DLO, but I was so clear that in a prep motion, they will have their own arguments. They will not have the time to respond. They will possibly only respond to the principle because it connects to their principle, and these two things will remain unengaged. So the fact that this was predicted was very useful because our speaker just said, look, here are two strategic paths to victory that they did not engage. Then I said, okay, what will we do for the rest of our speech? The first is we will defend the principle, but use, strategy 2 that we learned in this lecture, which is we will characterize better and say that their characterization is lacking, right? Because firstly, the principle from opposition is some individuals are hurt in the process and they deserve to, protect their right to express their religion. Like people should have the right to wear the hijab. The first response or the first way we characterize this is by saying, look, religion, for that argument to be true, religion must be valuable to you, but neutral to others. But that is not true. Religion is not neutral to others and literally dictates life as a moral authority. It tells you if you're a woman and you don't wear the hijab, you're an infidel and you will go to hell, right? And that is in the worst case hate speech and therefore, or slander. And therefore it's not offense or discomfort, but rather hate that is the metric that we are using. And then comes the characterization where we say, look, this is not hypothetical. There are reasons why when you see even something like a turban or a hijab, you are reminded of those hateful things or those attacks or that form of harassment. And that is because every individual has experienced that interaction at some point in their life where religious people come and give them reasons to convert to their religion and, feel worse about the current religion they're in or the current lifestyle they're in. There are three reasons for this. Number one, religion is a competitive market space where you continuously want more followers and want more donations. Thus, even most non-members have been proselytized and therefore they know this, which is why when you see a hijab, that's what it reminds you of. Number two, it's not just a one-off. This is a message that is continuously reinforced because the way religions operate is by making you feel insecure. You need to feel insecure. You need to feel like you're going to hell on a daily basis so that you convert. And it's not just members of organized religion, which is number three. It's also everyday individuals, right? Who feel it is their religious duty to proselytize and inform others about the word of God. Now, how this was eventually used is by saying, look, both could be true. You might just not be affected by hijab and see it as an everyday thing, but you could genuinely feel traumatized by being reminded of the hate that reminds you. As a non-hijab wearing woman, that could genuinely traumatize you. What we've done is given you more reasons to believe this is more likely than the other. It's very similar as a strategy to what was used in the debate, about comedy and comedians. And this was basically the framing for it, where we basically said, we win the principal clash because we prove that, or we give reasons why it eventually becomes slander or becomes hate, even if that's not what the intention is. Now, part 3 of my DPM speech was basically the last strategy, which is we have to flip our opponent's metric. What was the opponent's metric? Minorities will isolate. When you ban the hijab, when you ban things like basically prevent the practice of religion in public, these identities are really important to them. We did this in many, many ways, and this was potentially the most powerful part of our case. The first thing we said is, look, it's a this house would motion. It's not this house supports, which means it's a this house supports motion, not a this house would, which means opposition needs to defend the status quo. In the status quo, a lot of religious expression is already banned, right? In Digambara Jain Hinduism, they want to be nude because they believe being nude in public makes them closer to God. But nudity is outlawed. We already banned it. Shia self-flagellation, which we see in Bangladesh on a regular basis, is banned because Westerners are uncomfortable seeing it, right? There are countless examples of minority expressions in the status quo already being wiped out. And these are just the beginning. Those are because that's the smaller minority. You already see the first few examples of bigger minorities being hurt, and Muslims are the first target. If you look all across Europe, there's been a huge increase in right-wing politicians. So the brothers of Italy, after winning the elections in 2023, restricted the construction of mosques. In Switzerland, minarets are banned, but church crosses are not. So in mosques, you cannot have a minaret because they think that's against, religion. So they want to be secular, etc. But church crosses are still made very public because they believe it's a part of Swiss culture. It represents their history, right? In France, the burqa is banned because Marine Le Pen, and it's only going to get worse because Marine Le Pen has now gotten the highest number of seats she's ever gotten in the past. And the point we wanted to establish was there's a huge amount of right-wing rise or political rise of the right wing all across Europe, which would only make these problems worse going into the future. The conclusion that was drawn from these first 2 points was, look, opposition needs to defend the reality of today, which is a euphemized Christian space where Muslims and other minorities are being oppressed already. In the very worst case, what we do is we stop that harassment. And the way we frame that is by saying, on our side, when Christianity is absent from the public space, Muslims feel more comfortable to come out and interact, even if they cannot fully practice their own faith. Hence, we make public spaces more comfortable for minorities, right? And we also frame by saying, look, this also empowers minorities because they no longer feel selectively targeted, which is the status quo. The policy is more universal. It stops religious expression all across. Therefore, it's still better to do this because at least it equalizes it and empowers minorities to think, no, the state is not against me. So how are we winning on opposition's metric? Number one, we actually empower minorities by stopping the Christian harassment that exists in the status quo. Number two, we basically argued why we emancipate the most vulnerable minorities by challenging the premise of what OO believes. So remember how, in the debate about platforming, we said, or I said that the assumption of opening opposition is that minorities don't want to go to these platforms. That's untrue, right? Here we did the same thing. We challenged the premise of that entire argument, which is that minorities want to wear the hijab, or the vast majority of minorities want to wear the turban. And we basically challenged that intuition. We said, look, if you look at the United States, only 20% of Muslim women wear the hijab, and the number is even smaller for Sikh men wearing the turban. This is because a vast majority of religious individuals are multicultural, and they see that, these kinds of things are prevention from access to other kinds of fulfillment. So you can't access beauty by displaying your hair if you're wearing the hijab. Now, what this tells you is, since it's not something that is widely prevalent and it's not practiced by most Muslims or most Muslim women, maybe a lot of Muslim women who do practice it also want to exit and find it oppressive, right? But they don't have a choice because it's an extremely awkward conversation for them to tell their parents, look, I'm quitting the hijab, something that I've been doing for 15 years, because their parents will feel like they're letting go of something their God wants them to do. How does our side solve this problem? Our side allows these individuals to get rid of the hijab by externalizing the blame to the state, by saying, look, it's not that I have a choice. The state has created this mandate for me when I go to the public. And then, the analysis about, what people really want, which we learned in the first part of today's lecture, you can say, look, the average parent does actually want to send their kids to school. And therefore, because this is now an externalized harm, it's much easier for them to converse and explain this at home and, free themselves. So the second way in which we emancipate the most vulnerable minorities is by saying, look, the group of people you want to protect, say the 100 hijabi women that now have to let go, of that, we break the intuition that most of them want to wear the hijab. We say that maybe 50 to 60 of them don't want to wear the hijab, and we help that conversation by externalizing the blame onto the state. This was in my pre-scripted Gov Whip. I was very I was very clear that I wanted to build up winning on this metric. So I even scripted parts of my Gov Whip where I basically said, in addition to what DPM runs, you also need to mitigate the best case, right? Where let's say that you, where the rhetoric, and look at the way it's been scripted, where you say, let's pretend we live in the La La land where all religions have equal right to expression. Opposition believes hijabi women will now isolate and segregate themselves from rest of society. We don't think this is true. Number one, spirituality evolves, right? So the illustration we used was, look, in Islam, investing in fixed interest rates is haram, right? But people still do that because they realize there are no alternatives than the banking system. You need to keep your money somewhere that is safe, right? And in much the same way, we imagine these articles of clothing are important now because that is an alternative. But if the state says it is not, in time, it will also be less important to their spiritual fulfillment, because it's not like a Muslim man, because they take interest rates, which are haram, feels really, really bad on an everyday level. Like I'm a Muslim, I don't go through that. I'm sure most of you don't go through that. You need to imagine a world where the hijab has been banned for a certain amount of time. I don't think this will be an important part of fulfillment. If anything, religious imams and clerics will, evolve and not prioritize this going forward. The second metric was parents care about, one second. Okay. Sorry about that. That was my mom. Parents care more about the education of their child in most cases than they do about their hijab. And the way this was explained is by saying, look, unlike the developing world, when you think about the developed world, most immigrant families have moved to the developed world for the pursuit of a better life. Think about the Indian parents who've sacrificed everything by moving from India, or the Pakistani parents who've sacrificed everything by moving from Pakistan. The reason why they did that is for economic well-being, and some of that well-being would possibly not come in their own lives. It would be given to their kids. What they've done is they've sacrificed a lot of cultural safety and religious safety that could be there in Pakistan for pursuit of economic well-being. Because obviously, it's much easier to practice being a Muslim in Pakistan than it is in the United States. So the way we explained it is by saying, the metric through which they make decisions when it comes to Western liberal democracies, even if you're an immigrant parent, is economic well-being and the future of their child. So if that is something that is coming under some degree of risk, they will more likely let go of culture or religion in order to make sure they still access the public and still interact and get that economic emancipation. So what is the summary of this whole thing? I just wanted to take you guys through one detailed example of a case where all of the strategic things we've discussed is put into place. Number one, I think do spend time thinking on what your opposition will say. All of the things I've discussed were not thought of in the middle of the debate. They were pre-scripted. I knew what opposition would say. I realized what they would not respond to. I realized what they would prioritize. The framing or the way the responses were made were also to challenge the way they would prioritize, but also the characterization was done in order to break the deadlocks. And the most important thing is there was a substantial amount of time spent on winning in opposition's metric. It was particularly important in this debate because of the fact that it's a much more skewed motion to opposition, where their metric will be really hard to break. So winning on that metric became very critical. So cool. Thank you guys for joining. It's been 1 hour, 35 minutes. I hope that was useful. Inshallah, the next few trainings of BDC Digital Academy will also be useful for you. And I really hope you guys keep attending. I'll close the recording now because this bit will be posted. But if there are questions that you have, I'll answer them after I close the recording. Yeah, so thank you very much for joining, guys.